So the title of tonight's presentation is LaRouche's Economic Revolution. And that is what we are talking about, a revolution. We're not talking about economic or banking reform. We're not talking about something like auditing the Fed. What we are talking about is reimposing the authority of the United States Constitution over monetary, financial, banking, and economic policy. We're talking about taking back constitutional control over our economic system and eliminating the power over our economy and over our nation from the traders and thieves of Wall Street. We will uphold the law of the United States Constitution. We will insist that Wall Street not be allowed to violate the United States Constitution. Now, as many of you know, there is currently a great deal of discussion now going on about what's wrong with the Federal Reserve, the role of the Federal Reserve in creating the hyperinflation, which we are now seeing. But one of the things that, and this is all good, this is very, very good. We have not had this kind of national discussion breaking out on economic, banking, and financial policy for a long, long time. But one of the things that is noticeably lacking from much of this discussion, maybe not all of it, but from much of the discussion, is, okay, the Federal Reserve is bad, it's destroying us. What do we do about it? How do we fix this? What is the solution? And as I stated, minuscule reforms or tinkering with the system, are not going to cut it. One is the principle of constitutional banking. We are proposing a return to constitutional banking, to outlaw all the practices which violate the United States institution, and to essentially to demand that all banking policy, all monetary policy must abide by the Constitution. That is number one. That is the most important thing. And secondly, to recognize why we're making these proposals, why we need to return to national banking, which is that the only real mission here, the only real mission has nothing to do with money per se. It has nothing to do with any of that. And if thinking about national banking, all you can think about is how are we going to manage money, you're making a big mistake. The only mission is to ask the question, how are we going to rescue, rebuild, and launch a revolution in our productive economy? And I would ask those of you, as we go into this discussion, those of you who were took part in the class last Saturday, to reflect in your memory on the discussion of Hamilton's report on manufacturers, in terms of what he lays out in the report on manufacturers, and a discussion in which Hamilton makes it explicitly clear that everything he is proposing in terms of national banking, a national credit policy, bounties, premiums, tariff policies, infrastructure policies, that everything he's doing, it's all being done for a single purpose, a single mission, which is to build up the productive economy, the physical economy, a technologically progressive economy for the United States. Because the question really is, what do we do about it? Now, I'm going to go through 5 or 6 things. One is the initial steps to be taken. The second is the question of constitutional money. The third is national banking policy. The fourth is general policies. And the fifth is credit policies. I'm going to go through it very quickly because I want to leave a lot of time for discussion. So initial steps. Well, the first initial step is to reimpose Glass-Steagall. This is the legislation that was passed under Franklin Roosevelt, which puts a wall between investment banking and commercial banking, and it outlaws the commercial banks and other such institutions from engaging in any form of financial speculation whatsoever. They are absolutely illegal and absolutely prohibited from engaging in financial speculation. We will reimpose and restore Glass-Steagall and apply it all the way down the line through the banking system. As I said, we will erect an iron wall which will be enforced to the full extent of the law. Now, this is a vital step because there are over 5,000 banks in this country, and we are not talking about shutting down the banking system. We're not talking about nationalizing the banking system. The 5,000 plus private banks which exist in the United States are absolutely vital to restarting a productive economy. The purpose of Glass-Steagall is, on the one hand, to save those banks, because what you're doing is you are shearing off from these banks the speculative practices which have corrupted them and which have brought them to the level of ruin. You're shearing that all off, and you're going to reorganize these banks, as was done under Roosevelt. So it's been done before. You are going to reorganize these banks as regulated commercial enterprises and return them. They're going to have to relearn some of this, but there are still a lot of people around who remember how it was before. You're going to return them to sound commercial banking processes. And they will become part of a national private banking system overseen by a national bank. We are going to, through an act of Congress, we are going to revoke the independence of the Federal Reserve, and we are going to return it to direct supervision of the United States Treasury, as the United States Constitution insists. We will end the independence of the Fed, and we will make the Fed a mere agent of the Treasury. Now, don't get confused by the terminology here, because at the point that you do that, you could rename the Federal Reserve, the Third National Bank of the United States, or the Third United States Bank, or you could give it any name you want. You're making it a national bank by taking these steps, is what you're doing. The Fed will no longer be allowed to print money. That money will be restored to the U.S. Treasury. As I said, it will be restricted to acting. It will be restricted. It'll be reduced to acting as the mere agent of the Treasury. And really the primary and almost sole function of the Fed at that point, or a national bank at that point, will be to act as the transferor of U.S. Treasury notes into the private banking system. All other practices of the Federal Reserve as they now exist, the Open Market Committee, the discount window, the federal funds rates, all of these things will simply be abolished. They will be abolished. And the U.S. Treasury will take complete control over printing United States Treasury notes, which will then be put on deposit in the national bank and will be made available for circulation into the private banking system. And we will discuss how that's going to occur. We will remonetize American Treasury gold reserves at $500 an ounce, and the market price, whichever is higher, but at a fixed value. And all subsequent U.S. Treasury notes will be backed by gold. This does not mean a gold standard. It does not mean you'll be able to go into a bank and get gold for your dollar or silver for your dollar. It will be a gold reserve system as existed in the 1950s, 1960s, and up to 1971, in which the dollar is backed by gold and pegged to a certain value of gold. Now, the way the banking system is going to operate is it will operate on the basis of state-created credit, as LaRouche emphasized, and I really can't emphasize this enough, that this question of state-created credit is the fundamental issue for a national banking system. Without it, nothing else you do is going to work. It's just going to be bunk. It won't work. We are erecting a state-created system of credit and national banking. Now, the way this will work is that the Federal Reserve will print, the new national bank, the reformed federal, not reformed, but the, well, you get the idea. The transformed Federal Reserve, the new national bank, the United States Treasury will print money, U.S. Treasury notes, gold reserve Treasury notes. Those notes will then be deposited in the national bank. That bank then will have the authority through its local branches. Now, remember, there are currently 12 branches of the Federal Reserve, and there are also about 20 sub-branches of the Federal Reserve, which a lot of people are not aware of. All of those branches of the Federal Reserve will remain in existence, but they will be, again, transformed. They will become branches of the new national bank. So you're not just talking about one institution. It is one institution, a national bank, but you will have 12, or maybe if you make all of these subdivisions branches, you'll have over 30 branches of the national bank in various cities all over the country. And these U.S. Treasury notes will be deposited by the United States Treasury in all of these various branches of the national bank. Those branches of the national bank will then loan that money out throughout the private banking system, not this select group of, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, not this select group. They're going to have to stand in line like everyone else. But the branches of the national bank will loan this money out throughout the private banking system. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about now a private banking system governed by Glass-Steagall regulations. So these banks are not going to be able to take this money these private banks, these 5,000 private banks throughout the country, are not going to be able to take this money and go and loan it out to speculate in real estate or speculate in the stock market or speculate in anything else. They're not going to be allowed to do that. They're not going to be allowed to engage in those practices themselves, which they all currently do, or to loan the money out for those practices. This will all be illegal. So they will be restricted by the national bank, that the money which they are receiving from the national bank, the money which the national bank is loaning to them, can only be loaned out for productive practices. Now, for productive investment. Now, LaRouche also proposed that what we impose upon the nation's private banks, these 5,000 plus banks, that what we impose is two things. One is a 100% reserve requirement, which will not apply to credit from the national bank, but will apply to other loans the banks make. Because don't forget, banks in this country have money on deposit. People open up accounts in banks. Corporations have banking accounts. Individuals have banking accounts. And these banks have a great deal of money on deposit, which they are not getting directly from the national bank. And obviously, they can loan that money out. They can make loans to Tom, Dick, and Harry. But what LaRouche proposes is that in terms of the deposits that banks have on, money banks have on deposit, or their operating capital, that a 100% reserve requirement be imposed, which means that banks, they can make all kinds of discretionary loans for various things. But that, in operating with their own capital, that they have a 100% reserve requirement, which means that they not be allowed out of their own money to loan out more than they have on deposit or in capital, that they be restricted to that. Now, that reserve requirement would not apply to money they are receiving from the national bank, because the money they are receiving from the national bank is restricted to investment in manufacturing, agriculture, infrastructure, and other sorts of things. Sometimes people say, well, it's too restrictive. It's really not that restrictive if you think it through. And now, along with this, what LaRouche is proposing is a two-tier credit system. Now, some people say this can't be done. I've heard people say this. It absolutely can be done. It's not as difficult as it sounds. Obviously, money from that the banks are receiving from the national bank, this new constitutional currency, this money is going to be restricted for productive investment. This will all be loaned out at a very low interest rate. And I'm not going to try to pick what the interest rate is, but at a very low interest rate into productive investment. Now, otherwise, in terms of what the banks are loaning out through their own reserves, their own deposits, et cetera, here is where you get into the question of a two-tier credit system, where you are saying, okay, well, if you're loaning money out for something useful, we'll loan it out at a lower rate of interest. If you're loaning money out to something useless, like, I don't know, building a new version of Disneyland somewhere, or opening up a new gambling casino in Las Vegas, something which does not directly contribute to the productive economy, then you are going to have to charge a higher rate of interest. And the question arises, well, who decides what's productive or not non-productive, and blah blah blah. It's not as complicated as it sounds, and it can easily be managed, and it can easily be done. The idea here is that you are adopting a deliberate policy, as Hamilton did, as Lincoln did, and in many ways as Franklin Roosevelt did, although in a somewhat different way. But particularly, it's clearest under Hamilton and Lincoln. You are adopting a deliberate banking and credit policy to foster productive investment. So are you discriminating in favor of productive investment? Yes, you are. And that's constitutional. And that's what Hamilton writes extensively about in his defense of the National Bank, the Constitution of the National Bank, and in the report of the manufacturers. And that's precisely what Lincoln did with the greenback policy. It is a discriminatory policy. We are going to reward people who help build the nation up, and we are going to penalize people who engage in financial speculation to get rich. That's exactly what we're going to do. Now, people would say, well, if you have 100% reserve requirements on these banks, isn't this going to restrict investment? Won't this even be deflationary? No, it won't. Because, you hear people say today that inflation is caused by printing too much money. I heard this on Tucker Carlson the other night. Well, that's just not true. Inflation is not caused by printing too much money. Inflation is caused by what you do with the money. As I said, almost all of the money, well, all of the money, not almost all of the money, all of the money the Federal Reserve prints today goes to their 24 primary lenders on Wall Street, right? Most of it never gets out, never gets into the rest of the banking system at all. And all of this is now going into investments in financial assets, right? Now, this is wildly inflationary. But if you are, if Treasury notes from the National Bank are being loaned out and circulated into through the 10 or 20 or 30 branches of the National Bank into the hundreds and thousands of private banks, and that money is being restricted for productive investment, developing new forms of nuclear energy, building infrastructure projects, financing entrepreneurs or venture capitalists who are investigating new forms of fusion energy, going into agriculture, going into this, going into that. And it's not just big corporations, but machine tool businesses, subcontractors for the space program, the tens of thousands of small entrepreneurs who are doing something useful and productive. If that's where your money is going, there is no limit, and I mean no limit, to how much money the Treasury can be put into circulation. The only limit is a physical limit, not a monetary limit. It's a physical limit, which is how much money can your productive economy absorb, right? If you've got people doing something useful and productive, you can print the money to do it. And the only way you stop printing the money is if you've saturated the demand for that money among productive entrepreneurs, right? And this is a sovereign credit system. Now, we're not talking about an economy in which the government runs everything, right? First of all, as I said, you don't, the private banking institutions as they exist in this country, once they're restored to soundness under Glass-Steagall provisions, you want those banks to remain in private hands. You want them to have a certain amount of freedom as to, going out and looking for people who they might want to loan money to, individual businesses in their area who come to them with an idea of something they want to build or invest in. You want private, the kind of creativity that exists, and also a certain amount of risk taking, not financial risk taking like speculation, but real risk taking. Someone says, I want to invest in building something, like Thomas Edison. And you say, okay, I'll take the risk. And then, of course, maybe the invention goes kaflooey and you lose your money on it. But you want that kind of imagination, as I discussed last week, to be operational within what you're doing. There's also the question, which I'm not going to dwell on tonight, and I hope it doesn't come up for discussion in the question answer period, because really I don't have an answer to it. There's the question of should the national bank itself be owned by the government, or should it be a private institution which operates as the mere agent of the government? Now, I could tell you, perhaps I missed it, but I have read extensively in what LaRouche has been writing about this stuff. And he never really answers that question. He implies certain things, but he never really answers it directly. And in fact, when you look at this, when you look at everything I'm talking about, two-tier credit system, this, blah, this, that, the other thing, there are many things that are going to have to be done, details. And a lot of the details are open for debate. They're open for discussion. You're going to have to sort of, come up with solutions as you do this, as you're building a credit system, as you're restarting our productive economy. Problems are going to arise. Questions are going to arise. You can't answer them all today. The only thing you have to remain loyal to is that this system must operate within constitutional principles. It must not violate the Constitution. That is the one thing that is not open for debate. But as to specific answers on specific things, we're going to have to deal with this as we go along. But as I was saying, the government is not going to run everything, right? In terms of banking and credit and monetary policy, well, I've laid out a little bit of this, the bare bones outline of this. The Treasury will reimpose its monopoly right to print money. Yes, the government will print our money. That is, after all, what the Constitution says. And the Treasury will decide how to put that into circulation, and that will be done through this national banking system. Essentially what we're talking about here, a lot of what LaRouche proposes, it's not identical, but a lot of what he proposes is very, very similar to Lincoln's greenback policy. Now, it's not identical. The greenbacks were 160 years ago. We're living in 2022. We have a much different situation today. But in principle, a lot of what Lynn puts forward is taken from Lincoln's greenback policy, only with a national bank added to it, a Hamiltonian national bank, which really is the better way to do it. Lincoln had to do the greenbacks without a national bank, and he did a damn good job. But this idea of depositing the Treasury notes in a national bank and then using the bank to circulate the money is a very good idea, as long as the bank is tightly restricted in what it does by the U.S. Treasury.